My name is Carly Spears. I am 38 years old, and I am a major in the United States Marine Corps. On the day I buried my father, the Ohio sky hung low and gray, spitting a freezing rain that turned the cemetery paths into ribbons of mud. I stood beneath the burial tent in my dress blues, with my spine straight, my shoulders squared, and my eyes fixed on the brass handles of his oak casket. I was there for the man inside that box. I had crossed the country to salute him one final time, and I intended to give him every ounce of dignity I had left. But standing only inches from his casket was the most poisonous part of my family. My older sister, Vanessa, had her arm looped through Darren's, as if our father's funeral were a stage built for the two of them. 3 years earlier, she had slept with the man I was supposed to marry. Now, she leaned into him, glanced at the ribbons on my chest, and gave me the same, thin, triumphant smile she had worn the night I caught them. "Poor thing," she murmured loudly enough for the relatives around us to hear. 38, and completely alone. Nobody wants a stiff, dried-up soldier like you. Darren's eyes traveled over my uniform with open contempt. Several relatives looked at me with the kind of pity people reserve for someone they believe has failed at life. They saw a single woman in military dress and decided I must be lonely. They saw Vanessa's plunging black dress, Darren's polished shoes, and the oversized stone on her finger, and decided she had won. I did not cry. I did not argue. I gave them a cold smile and lifted one gloved hand. "Is that so?" I asked. "Then perhaps you should meet my husband." Beyond the rows of wet headstones, a black armored vehicle had just turned onto the cemetery drive. A man stepped out beneath the rain and began walking toward us with the calm, deliberate stride of someone who had never needed to prove his power by raising his voice. Vanessa's smile vanished. The fingers covered in cheap, flashy jewelry began to tremble. Darren's face tightened as recognition spread across it. That was the moment their performance began to collapse. But to understand why the sight of one man could drain the blood from both of their faces, you have to understand what they had done to me, what I had survived, and what they had mistaken for weakness. The whispers of my relatives moved across the wet cemetery like insects crawling over stone. My polished heels sank into the thick Ohio mud, but I did not shift my weight. I kept my breathing slow and invisible. The rain gathered along the brim of my cover and ran cold against the back of my neck. My hands were closed at my sides inside crisp white ceremonial gloves. Vanessa floated at the edge of my vision. Her dress was cut so low it belonged in a nightclub, not beside our father's grave. She never once looked at his framed photograph. She never bowed her head. Instead, her sharp eyes moved through the crowd, counting who was staring at her, who had noticed the ring on her left hand, and which of our aging aunts looked impressed. The stone was enormous, almost the size of a quail egg, and it threw harsh white flashes whenever she moved. Anyone with experience could have seen that it was not a natural diamond, but Vanessa had built her entire life around surfaces. She did not care whether something was real. She cared whether strangers believed it was expensive. Her perfume reached me before she did, a suffocating synthetic gardenia that buried the clean smell of wet earth, pine needles, and cold rain. Even at our father's funeral, she had found a way to make the room, the tent, and the grief revolve around her. Then gravel crunched behind us. A black Mercedes S-Class rolled up the cemetery drive. Darren stepped out and adjusted his silk tie. The temporary dealership plate was still attached to the back, an obvious sign that the car was a weekend rental, but most of our relatives did not notice. They saw the silver emblem on the hood and immediately decided he must be successful. He shot his cuffs, raised his chin, and approached the burial tent like a politician, inspecting people who owed him loyalty. He did not look at the casket. He did not touch my father's photograph. He came straight to me. "Hello, Carly," he said, his voice coated in false concern. His breath carried stale coffee, mints, and arrogance. "I heard you are still hiding on that miserable base out west. Just you and the grunts. Such a shame." He paused so everyone nearby could hear him. "You know, if you had learned how to be a real woman, if you had been a little softer and a little less rigid, perhaps you would be living the good life now, like Vanessa." It was not an accidental insult. It was a planned strike. He needed the family to believe that betraying me had been reasonable, even intelligent. He needed them to see him not as a man who had cheated on his fiancée with her sister, but as a successful man who had upgraded from a cold soldier to a glamorous woman. Uncle Bob nodded as though Darren had delivered wisdom. His old suit smelled of mothballs and cigars. "Poor Carly," he muttered, loudly enough to be heard. "All that rank, all those medals, and not one man willing to look at her twice. What a waste." Around him, other relatives gave me cheap looks of sympathy. In their world, a Marine Corps uniform earned through blood, broken bones, sleepless nights, and foreign deserts meant less than a rented German car. Honor had no market value. Service did not impress them. Sacrifice did not matter. They measured human worth in jewelry, labels, credit limits, and the ability to make other people jealous. My fingers tightened into fists. The white gloves stretched across my knuckles. I pressed my nails into my palms until pain cut through the numbness. Warm blood gathered against the cotton. Pain grounds you. Pain keeps the monster contained. In the field, I had trusted the Marines to my left and right with my life. We had carried one another without hesitation. Yet in the town where I had grown up, the people who shared my blood were twisting knives into me beside my father's grave. I refused to give them a reaction. A commanding officer does not expose an open wound to the enemy. I stared through Darren, as though he were smoke. My silence irritated him. He scoffed, turned his back on me, and walked toward the wooden podium that held the leather-bound guest register. From his vest pocket, he removed a gold-plated Mont Blanc pen. He made a show of holding it where everyone could see. Then he flicked off the cap. Click. The sharp, metallic sound cut through the rain and struck something buried deep inside me. In an instant, the cemetery blurred. The freezing Ohio air vanished. The click became another sound from another room. 3 years earlier, the sound of my engagement ring hitting a tempered glass coffee table. I was 35 then, and I had just returned from a brutal 6-month deployment in the Middle East. I went straight from the transport hub to Darren's downtown architecture firm because I wanted to surprise him. I had not showered. My utility uniform was stiff with dried sweat and dust. I smelled faintly of diesel, sand, and recycled aircraft air. My boots felt as if they weighed 10 pounds each. In one hand, I carried a plastic bag of pad thai from his favorite place on 4th Street. I was exhausted, jet-lagged, and running on the foolish belief that Darren was my safe harbor. In a world built around ambushes, risk assessments, and life-or-death decisions, I had convinced myself that he was the one civilian person with whom I could lower my guard. Innocence is a dangerous blind spot. The hallway outside his office was empty. It was after 9 on a Friday night. My rubber soles made almost no sound on the commercial carpet. I moved through that air-conditioned corridor like a ghost. 10 steps from his door, I stopped. Something was wrong. The first thing I noticed was the perfume. Gardenia. Heavy, sweet, aggressive. Vanessa bought it by the bottle. I knew that scent as well as I knew the smell of rifle oil. Darren's office door was open by 2 inches. The lights inside were dim. Then I heard my sister's high, breathless giggle, tangled with a man's low groan. Darren's groan. I did not rush in. I stood still and let the truth settle over me like ice water. "Do not worry about her," Vanessa cooed from inside. "Carly is as dry as sandpaper. She does not know anything about passion. She just plays dress-up in men's clothes to hide how pathetic she is. A real man needs a woman, Darren, not a soldier." My hand went numb. The bag slipped from my fingers and hit the floor. The foam container burst open, spilling hot noodles and dark sauce across the beige carpet. Inside the silent hallway, the sound landed like a mortar. The giggling stopped. I pushed the door open. It struck the wall with a hard crack. They were tangled together on the black leather sofa. Darren went pale and scrambled backward, dragging up his trousers with shaking hands. He looked exactly like what he was, a coward caught inside the trap he had built. But the image that froze my blood was not simply my fiancé half-dressed beside my sister. It was what Vanessa had chosen to wear. She sat up and pulled a desert camouflage blouse across her chest. My blouse. The one I had left in Darren's closet before deployment. The eagle, globe, and anchor were stenciled over the pocket. My name tape Spears was stitched over the breast. That garment represented knights shivering at a forward operating base, convoys through hostile ground, and Marines who had never come home. Vanessa was wearing it like lingerie. She looked at me over the collar with open triumph, as though she had planted a flag on every part of my life. It was more than infidelity. It was desecration. "Carly, baby, wait," Darren stammered. "I can explain." His voice cracked. He sounded small. When a convoy is ambushed, you do not panic. You assess, decide, and move. I looked down at my left hand. The diamond engagement ring felt contaminated. I twisted it off and threw it across the room. It struck the glass coffee table with a sharp metallic clink. "You two pieces of garbage deserve each other," I said. My voice was flat. I gave them no tears, no screaming, and no performance they could later retell for entertainment. I turned on my heel. My boots stepped directly through the spilled takeout in the hallway, tracking sauce and grease across Darren's pristine carpet. I left the coward, the sister who had mocked my service, and the last piece of civilian innocence I still possessed. I drove to the underground garage, started my car, and hit the accelerator hard enough to make the tires scream against the concrete. I merged onto the interstate and let the darkness swallow the road ahead. That same night, I filed for an emergency transfer. I requested orders to Camp Pendleton, placing nearly 3,000 miles of highway and desert between me and the wreckage in Ohio. I drove west in a numb, mechanical trance. I never turned on the radio. I did not cry. I survived on bitter truck stop coffee and the steady hum of tires over asphalt. By the time I reached California, I had stopped thinking of Ohio as home. I refused the base housing available to a field grade officer. I needed the cheapest place I could find, because my father's pancreatic cancer had worsened. The bills were multiplying faster than the doctors could explain them. Specialists, deductibles, medications, private hospice care, transportation, and charges that arrived in envelopes thick enough to feel like threats. I knew Vanessa and Darren would not sacrifice anything to keep him comfortable, so I took the weight. I rented a rundown ground-floor apartment near the industrial side of Oceanside. The walls were thin, the carpet was stained, and the rooms smelled of old cigarettes and bleach. I did not care. Comfort was an expense I could no longer justify. On the first day of every month, I transferred 80% of my salary into the family medical account. I sent every dollar of hazard pay I had saved from deployment. I kept only enough to cover rent, fuel, and the smallest amount of food required to function. For 6 months, I lived on 25-cent packets of chicken-flavored ramen. I could not afford a table or even a chair. Every night, I sat cross-legged on cracked linoleum beneath a flickering kitchen light, eating from a foam cup while staring at peeling cabinet paint. On base, I operated like a machine. I directed complex Pacific logistics, solved supply failures, demanded precision, and carried responsibility for people and equipment worth more than anything my relatives could imagine. My Marines saw an officer who never hesitated, but each night, when I locked the deadbolt behind me, the engine shut down. The silence of that apartment pressed against my chest. In that silence, Vanessa's words returned, dry as sandpaper, playing dress-up, pathetic, not a real woman. Gaslighting is not always loud. Sometimes it is a slow drip that enters when you are exhausted and alone. I began asking myself whether she was right. Perhaps I was only military hardware wearing a human face. Perhaps discipline had made me impossible to love. Perhaps Darren had betrayed me because something essential was missing inside me. I could withstand the pressure wave of an explosion, yet the cruelty of my own family was bending me in places no armor could protect. I was starving myself to keep my father alive, while the people nearest him treated me like an account number. Then came the night that almost ended everything. I sat on the kitchen floor with another cup of noodles in my lap. The apartment was dark, except for the blue light of my phone. I opened Instagram and saw a new post from Vanessa. She and Darren were reclining beside the turquoise water of a 5-star resort in Cabo San Lucas. Vanessa held a cocktail inside a hollowed pineapple. Her left hand was angled toward the camera to display a huge new ring. The caption celebrated finding her soulmate and living her best life in paradise. My stomach cramped. The noodles in my mouth tasted like ash. I looked around at the stained walls and the empty room. I was sacrificing my pay, my health, my youth, and my sanity to help our dying father. The sister who had betrayed me was drinking imported rum beneath a Mexican sun. Then the question struck me. Where had they found the money? Darren's firm was struggling. Vanessa barely worked part-time retail. A trip like that was far beyond what either of them could afford. The answer came with brutal clarity. The family medical account. The money I had been sending home. They were not merely ignoring the bills. They were taking from the account and using my hazard pay to finance the illusion of wealth. The injustice emptied my lungs. I hurled the cup across the room. It hit the wall and exploded, splashing broth over the paint. I slid down the drywall, pulled my knees to my chest, and finally believed every poisonous thing Vanessa had said. I was not a daughter to them. I was not a sister. I was an ATM they could drain and insult. I did not sleep. The next morning, thick fog covered the base, and freezing rain fell across the parking lot. My eyes burned. In my pocket was my end of active service paperwork. I had decided to resign my commission, turn in everything I had earned, and disappear from the life I had built. I reached for my car door. A huge, calloused hand slammed onto the hood. The metal shook beneath the impact. I turned and found Master Gunnery Sergeant Ruth standing in the rain. She was an E9, a legend on base, a woman in her early 50s who was hard as coffin nails. A jagged scar climbed the left side of her neck, a souvenir from the Gulf War. Water streamed from her utility uniform, but she did not seem to notice. She yanked open my door before I could speak. "You are wearing the face of a casualty, Major," she growled. "I do not take orders from an officer who lets her own past defeat her. Get out." "Master Gunny, I was just—" "Get out of the car, Spears." She grabbed my shoulder and pulled me into the rain. She did not ask whether I was all right. She did not offer sympathy. She shoved me into the passenger seat of her mud-covered Ford F-150 and drove off base. We stopped at a dark, windowless bar used by older veterans. It smelled of bleach, stale beer, and decades of bad choices. Ruth pulled out a stool, dropped a $20 bill on the sticky counter, and ordered 2 cheap whiskeys neat. She pushed one glass toward me. "Drink." I swallowed it. The alcohol burned all the way down and tore a hole through the fog in my head. Ruth tapped one thick finger against her empty glass. "I know about your transfer. I know about the paperwork in your pocket. And I know you are starving yourself to pay bills for people who would not spit on you if you were burning." I stared at the scratched wood. "They are my family," I said. "If I do not help, who will?" She laughed once, harsh and humorless. "Family? Your family has chosen to behave like the enemy. Why are you still treating them like allies?" The question hit harder than the whiskey. Ruth leaned closer. "Being soft is not the only way to be a woman, Carly. Your discipline is not dryness. Your loyalty is not pathetic. Carrying weight, protecting people, standing when everyone else folds, that is dignity. You are armor-piercing ammunition, Major. Do not let hollow civilians decide what you are worth." She stood, left money for the tip, and walked out. She left me in the dark, but she did not leave me empty. She had returned the keys to my own mind. That night, the wall of victimhood inside me cracked and fell. At 0430 the next morning, I tied my running shoes and hit the Pacific Coast Highway. I ran until my calves burned and my lungs tore at the air. I ran until the blisters on my heels burst and blood soaked through my socks. With every step, I drove Vanessa's voice farther from my head. I drove out Darren's betrayal. I drove out the idea that discipline made me unlovable. I was a United States Marine. I had sworn never to surrender. Yet I had been surrendering my mind to 2 domestic enemies who had never earned the right to occupy it. I stopped on a cliff above the ocean as the sun rose, sharp and blinding, over the water. For the first time in months, I felt the part of me that had survived deserts, loss, and command wake up again. Later that week, I entered a high-end department store. I walked past the pale glosses and delicate cosmetics Vanessa loved, the products designed to look sweet, fragile, and harmless. At another counter, I chose a heavy matte lipstick in deep burgundy, the color of dried blood on a field bandage. In the restroom mirror, I drew it across my lips. It was not decoration. It was war paint. I looked into my own eyes and made a decision. My crying was finished. My silence would no longer be submission. It would be the breath taken before action. I withdrew my transfer request. I fed my resignation paperwork into a shredder and watched every page disappear. Then I went back to work. Without the weight of self-doubt dragging behind me, my performance changed almost overnight. I stopped hiding in the background. I challenged weak plans, took control of failing operations, and built logistics networks with such precision that senior leaders in Washington began asking who had designed them. 6 months later, I stepped from an elevator into the Pentagon. My polished shoes struck the marble floor of the E-ring in a steady rhythm. Under my arm was a stack of classified folders. I had been selected as the lead logistics negotiator for a major Pacific defense contract. I entered the briefing room, carrying no expectation beyond the mission. At the far end of the long mahogany table sat Marcus Hamilton, Chief Executive Officer of Apex Defense, one of the largest logistics contractors on the East Coast. Darren had always covered himself in visible labels because he needed strangers to recognize the price of everything he wore. Marcus was his opposite. He wore a charcoal suit tailored so perfectly it seemed to absorb the fluorescent light. There was no oversized logo, no glittering jewelry, and no restless need for attention. He sat with the quiet authority of a man who knew exactly who he was. I stood at the podium and delivered a 45-minute analysis of vulnerabilities in the Pacific supply chain. I identified weak links, redundant expenses, exposure points, and contingency failures. While I spoke, Marcus never touched his phone. His eyes never wandered over my body the way some civilian contractors' eyes did. He listened. He took careful notes with an old silver fountain pen. When I finished, the room was silent. Marcus replaced the cap on his pen and looked directly at me. "Major Spears," he said in a low, steady voice. "That is the most ruthless and structurally sound analysis I have heard in 10 years. You just saved my company $4 million. There was no flirtation hidden inside the praise. He did not condescend. He respected my mind, my work, and the uniform I wore. That was the first thing I noticed about him. The second was that his actions always matched his words. Weeks later, when he asked me to dinner, he did not choose a chandeliered restaurant where he could display himself. He took me to a small steakhouse in Alexandria with sawdust on the floor and the best ribeye on the menu. When we stepped into the cold night afterward, he did not trigger the alarm of an exotic sports car from across the parking lot. He walked me to a heavy black Volvo SUV and opened the passenger door himself. I looked at the vehicle and raised an eyebrow. "Not the usual choice for a defense company CEO," I said. Marcus smiled as he closed the door with a solid, vault-like thud. Once he was behind the wheel, he started the engine and pulled into traffic. "It is one of the safest heavy-duty vehicles on the market," he said. "I do not need to drive fast to impress people I do not care about. I need to know the people inside this car will get home in one piece." That sentence told me more about him than any watch, car, or title could have. Darren had been a leaking tent, painted to resemble a mansion. Marcus was reinforced concrete. He noticed the faded scar beneath my jaw one evening while we sat on his porch. Darren had always called it ugly. He had suggested that I use more makeup so I would appear softer and more feminine. Marcus reached out and traced the raised line with his thumb. "A mark of courage," he said. "Do not hide it." He never asked me to become smaller so he could feel larger. He never treated my rank as competition. When deployments, briefings, or emergency calls pulled me away, he did not sulk. He adjusted. When the burden was mine to carry, he stood behind me instead of climbing onto my back. By the end of that first year, the bond between us had become something neither betrayal nor distance could weaken. One winter night, a fire burned in the stone fireplace of his living room. Marcus lowered himself onto one knee and opened a small velvet box. Inside was a deep ocean blue cashmere sapphire, set in heavy platinum. It did not throw harsh, artificial light. It seemed to hold depth inside it, dark and permanent. On the inside of the band, 2 words had been engraved. "Semper Fidelis," always faithful. "Carly," he said, his voice steady as bedrock, I love the woman standing in front of me, and I honor the Marine inside her. I want to be the rear guard holding the line, so you can always face forward. Darren had made promises as easily as he lied. Marcus had carved loyalty into metal before asking the question. I said yes. We married quietly. No spectacle, no social media campaign, no relatives invited merely to witness how much money had been spent. We signed the papers, stood before a small group of people we trusted, and built a life with a defensive perimeter neither Vanessa nor Darren knew existed. For 2 years, Marcus was my husband, my safe place, and the one person who never confused love with control. I did not tell my family. They had forfeited access to my private life, and I saw no reason to hand them information they would only weaponize. Then my father died, and life dragged me back to Ohio. The metallic click of Darren's pen at the cemetery had ripped open the past, but the burial service continued. I held my position through the final prayer, through the folding of the flag, and through the last shovelful of wet earth. Marcus had been delayed by weather, affecting clearance at the private airstrip. I knew he was close. I also knew I could stand alone until he arrived. 2 hours later, we gathered at my childhood home for the repast. The old colonial house was crowded with relatives, eating dry sandwiches, drinking cheap wine, and pretending grief had made them kind. Vanessa had already turned the living room into her personal stage. She moved from room to room with a glass of Merlot, issuing orders as if she owned the property. "Carly, get more ice from the garage," she snapped without looking at me. "And take off that costume. The military outfit is making everyone uncomfortable. This is a funeral, not Halloween." My back teeth pressed together. Costumi. The same dress blues I had worn while saluting the caskets of Marines who had died in service were a joke to her. I carried the ice bucket into the kitchen and said nothing. Around me, the relatives watched as though they expected me to obey every command. In their minds, Vanessa was the successful daughter, Darren was the generous businessman, and I was the aging military failure who had returned home with nothing but medals. Darren stood near the center of the living room and tapped his Mont Blanc pen against a wineglass. Clink, clink, clink. The room quieted. "If I could have everyone's attention," he announced. He adjusted his jacket and arranged his face into the solemn expression of a politician preparing to accept praise. "I want everyone to know that Vanessa and I spared no expense for her father's care. We made sure he had the best doctors, the best private room at hospice, and everything he needed. Family is everything to us. We were happy to cover the cost." Cold fury traveled up my spine. I knew every figure on the bank statements. I knew the dates and transfer amounts. 80% of my salary, every dollar of hazard pay. Month after month, while I ate noodles on a kitchen floor, Darren and Vanessa contributed almost nothing. The only items they had purchased for my father were 2 overpriced fruit baskets from a grocery store. Now Darren stood in my father's living room and stole credit for keeping him alive. He was constructing a monument to his generosity with the bricks of my poverty. The relatives applauded. Uncle Bob raised a plastic cup of beer toward Darren. "You are a good man," he said. "A blessing to this family." Then he looked at me with disappointment. "Shame Carly never learned how to contribute. What a waste of an upbringing." Vanessa slipped her arm through Darren's and approached the kitchen island where I stood. "Darren and I were talking," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You should leave the military. He is willing to hire you at his firm as an administrative assistant. You could file papers, answer phones, and fetch coffee for the real executives. He would pay you twice whatever the government gives you. It is honest work and much better suited to a single woman your age than rolling in the dirt with grunts." Several people laughed. That was the moment the final tripwire broke. They had insulted my service before. They had mocked my choices. But now, they were publicly reducing a Marine major, responsible for billion-dollar logistics systems, to a coffee girl so they could feel superior. The anger disappeared. My mind became perfectly quiet. Combat mode. I set the ice bucket on the granite counter. Thud. The nervous laughter stopped. I held Darren's eyes. Then I bit the fingertip of one white glove and slowly pulled it off. I removed the other, folded both into a clean square, and tucked them into my belt. I was no longer performing ceremonial duty. I was ready to engage. "I appreciate the offer, Darren," I said in the same command voice I used on a parade deck. But I have to decline. He rolled his eyes and drank from his glass. Do not let pride interfere, Carly. It is a charity offer. Take it. I am declining, I repeated, because my husband would be extremely unhappy if I left the Marine Corps to work for a company currently preparing to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The living room went silent enough for me to hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. Darren's face emptied of color. The wine-red arrogance vanished, leaving his skin gray. Without looking away from him, I reached into my pocket and removed my phone. A message had already been typed to the contact listed as Overwatch. One word. Execute. I pressed send. 2 seconds later, the front doorbell rang. The front door opened, and Marcus Hamilton stepped into the house. The pressure in the room changed immediately. He did not look like a man arriving late to a family gathering. He looked like someone entering territory he already controlled. His charcoal suit was immaculate despite the weather. His posture was calm, his expression unreadable. The whispers stopped. Marcus ignored the food, the wine, and the relatives staring at him. He moved through the crowd in a straight line toward me. In one hand, he carried a simple bouquet of white tulips. My apologies for the delay, Major, he said. His baritone voice carried through the room. The weather made clearance at the private airstrip difficult this afternoon. He handed me the flowers. Private airstrip. The words hung over the room like a live explosive. Vanessa stared at Marcus's wrist. As he reached for me, the cuff of his suit shifted and revealed a brushed steel Patek Philippe Nautilus. There were no diamonds on it. It did not need decoration. Anyone who understood real wealth knew that the watch was worth more than the house around us. Vanessa's glass slipped from her fingers. It shattered on the hardwood. Red wine spread across the beige rug like blood. She did not move. Darren took one step backward. His knees trembled. Sweat appeared along his forehead as he stared at Marcus. Mr. Hamilton, he said. CEO Hamilton, Apex Defense. Marcus turned his head slowly. Mitchell, he said. There was no anger in his voice, only recognition and ice. I am surprised to see you here. Darren forced a smile that looked painful. Yes, sir. Family emergency. We just buried my father-in-law. Is that right? Marcus asked. I would have expected you to be in your office today, explaining a $2 million tax fraud deficit to the Internal Revenue Service. Several relatives gasped. Uncle Bob lowered his beer and backed toward the wall. The same people who had praised Darren minutes earlier began creating physical distance from him. Darren held up both hands. That is a misunderstanding, sir. A clerical issue. We are undergoing a corporate restructuring. The firm is solid. Even with the truth closing around his throat, he clung to the performance. He would have preferred collapse to admitting he was broke. Marcus stepped beside me and placed one protective arm around my waist. Then he looked at Vanessa. I am not an actor hired to impress your family, he said. I am the man who acquired the Pacific Logistics contract your fiancé attempted to bribe his way into. I am also the man whose audit forced the liquidation of his firm. He paused. And most importantly, I am Carly's husband. We have been legally married for 2 years. Vanessa's legs failed. She dropped into a dining chair and gripped its arms until her knuckles whitened. The empire she and Darren had built from borrowed money, stolen credit, and my sacrifice cracked open in front of everyone. But Marcus was not finished. Corporate restructuring, he repeated, as if the phrase tasted rotten. You placed a second mortgage on your dying father-in-law's home at a predatory interest rate. You drained the remaining equity from this property so you could rent luxury cars and buy fake jewelry for people whose approval has no value. His eyes hardened. That is not restructuring, Mitchell. You are bankrupt. By tomorrow morning, you will also be homeless. The words struck me harder than anything else he had said. A second mortgage. I looked around the living room. The faded floral wallpaper had been chosen by my mother decades earlier. The oak floor carried marks from years of my father pacing when he worried. While I sat on cracked linoleum in California and sent home nearly everything I earned, Vanessa and Darren had leveraged the deed to my parents' house. They had consumed the final physical foundation of our family in order to finance a performance. They had not only stolen from me, they had stolen from a dying man. Vanessa released a guttural scream and lunged at Darren. Her hands closed around his lapels. "You lied to me!" she shrieked, shaking him. "You said the firm was landing major contracts. You said we were rich. You said we were buying a house in the hills." Darren did not defend himself. His arms hung uselessly at his sides. Sweat soaked his collar. His eyes were empty. Vanessa whipped toward Marcus. Mascara streamed down her cheeks. "How do you know about the house?" she demanded. "That loan was private." Marcus moved one step closer. "Because I own the intelligence firm that conducted the background investigation before his assets were liquidated. I know every move my opponents make before they realize they have made it." Then he looked at her with open disgust. "In fact, Vanessa, I should thank you. 3 years ago, you stole a useless man from my wife. You took out the trash before I arrived." Vanessa stared at the ring on her hand, then at the deep blue sapphire on mine. Panic overtook her. She clawed at her own finger until the skin reddened, finally wrenching off the oversized stone. "We will sell this," she cried at Darren. "You said it was a $50,000 investment. We can sell it and pay the mortgage." Marcus gave her a slow, pitiless smile. "That is a synthetic moissanite stone. He bought it online for approximately $300. Do not compare it to my wife's ring. You lost that war years ago." A high, broken wail escaped Vanessa. She threw the ring at Darren's face. It struck his forehead, bounced onto the hardwood, and rolled beneath the sofa. "I hate you!" she screamed. She attacked him again, dragging her acrylic nails down his cheek and leaving red lines in their path. "You liar! You ruined my life! You took everything from me!" Darren stood there and absorbed the blows. He had no defense left, because every lie had been stripped away. Marcus turned from them and surveyed the relatives pressed against the walls with paper plates and plastic cups in their hands. "The repast is over," he said. "It was not a request. My wife needs room to mourn her father. All of you, leave this house now." The room emptied in less than 2 minutes. People who had mocked me all day rushed for the door without making eye contact. Uncle Bob pulled his mothball-scented jacket tight and escaped with the others. Vultures scatter the moment they smell financial ruin. The front door slammed, and the house became hollow. Only Darren's ragged breathing and Vanessa's gasping sobs remained. Then a phone began vibrating against the glass coffee table. Darren's screen lit with a toll-free number. Marcus walked over, looked at the display, and pressed the green button. He activated the speaker. A flat, automated female voice filled the room. "This is an urgent message for Mr. Darren Mitchell regarding the property at this address. This is your final notice of default. Your secondary mortgage account is more than 90 days delinquent, with an outstanding balance of $14,700. The bank is proceeding with immediate foreclosure. The county sheriff's department will arrive to secure the property at 0800 hours tomorrow. All occupants must vacate and remove personal belongings before that time. Have a good day." The line disconnected. Vanessa collapsed onto the hardwood, directly into the puddle of spilled Merlot. The wine soaked into her expensive black dress. She did not notice. She stared at the wall as the arithmetic finally became real. The fake ring was worthless. The Mercedes was rented. The firm was gone. The house would be locked at 8 in the morning. The shiny life raft she had chosen over her sister was made of lead. Darren did not help her. Instead, the man who had stood in the middle of the room, offering me charity, dropped to his knees. His kneecaps struck the floor with a hard thud. Then he crawled toward me. He moved across the rug on his hands and knees until he reached my boots. The smell of sweat and sour wine rose from him. He grabbed the fabric of my uniform trousers with shaking hands. "Carly, please," he begged. Tears ran openly down his face. "I know I made mistakes. I know I hurt you. But remember how we used to be. Remember when we loved each other. Your father liked me. He would not want me on the street." Disgust rose in my throat. Minutes earlier, he had claimed credit for the bills I had paid. He had tried to humiliate me before my family. Now he was using my dead father's memory as a financial tool. "Please talk to Marcus," he continued. "Ask him for one subcontract. Just enough to save the house. I will do anything. I will clean floors at his headquarters. Please do not let me become homeless." I looked down at him and felt no anger, no satisfaction, and no pity. Only the detached certainty of a surgeon identifying tissue that had to be removed. I stepped backward sharply and tore my trousers from his grip. Then I brushed the place where his hands had touched my uniform. "Do not put my parents' names in your mouth again," I said quietly. He looked up at me. "You used money earned through my risk and sacrifice to finance your fake life. You betrayed me while I was overseas. You lied to a dying man, stole the equity from his house, and stood in this room claiming to be successful." I let the silence settle over him. "So act like a successful man. You stepped on a landmine you built yourself. Clean up your own damage." Marcus placed a warm, steady hand at the center of my back. "Let us go, Carly," he said. "The air in this house is too toxic." I nodded and walked toward the door. The freezing Ohio wind struck my face when I stepped onto the porch, but I did not shiver. The air felt clean. Behind us, Vanessa began screaming again. Darren shouted back. They tore at one another like starving animals fighting over rotten meat. I walked down the driveway to the black armored Volvo, climbed into the passenger seat, and pulled the door shut. The heavy vault-like thud cut off every sound from the house. For the first time, the past was sealed outside. The private jet climbed through the night and turned west, carrying us away from Ohio. Thousands of miles of dark ground opened beneath the wings. Inside the cabin, the engines produced a low, steady hum that wrapped around me like insulation. My combat boots rested on thick carpet. I sat in a wide leather seat and felt the tension in my neck begin to loosen for the first time since my father's condition had worsened. Across my lap lay the only object I had taken from the house before leaving, his old leather journal. The cover was cracked and soft from years of use. When I opened it, the scent of old paper, dust, and peppermint reached me. My father had always kept peppermints in his shirt pocket. I turned to the final page. The blue ink was faint and uneven. Cancer had made his hand shake, and in places, the pen had pressed so hard it nearly tore through the paper. But the words were clear. "I know Carly is carrying the heavy weight alone." My breath stopped. I continued reading. "My daughter is hard as forged steel, but even steel feels pain when it is struck. Vanessa chose the shining surface of things. Carly chose honor. She protects the world, even when the world refuses to protect her. I could not be more proud of my soldier. I pray she finds a man who understands exactly what she is worth, because this family does not deserve her." A sound broke from my throat before I could control it. The writing blurred. One hot tear dropped from my chin and struck the yellowed page. He had known. He had seen the money I sent. He had understood the months of sacrifice, the hazard pay, the food I skipped, and the weight I carried without asking for recognition. He had been too sick and too weak to stop Vanessa and Darren. But my sacrifice had not been invisible. My father had seen me. In those uneven lines, he gave me the validation I had spent years pretending I did not need. Marcus unbuckled his seatbelt and crossed the space between us. He did not offer empty phrases or tell me to be strong. He simply pulled me against his chest and wrapped both arms around me. For the first time in 38 years, I allowed myself to collapse. I buried my face in his charcoal jacket and cried. I cried for the father I had lost. I cried for the months spent eating noodles on a cold floor. I cried for the night I found my sister wearing my uniform. I cried for every time I had mistaken silence for strength and endurance for healing. Marcus held me without interruption. Every tear that soaked into his suit carried something out of me. The betrayal, the shame, the exhaustion, the need to prove that I could survive alone. By the time I lifted my head, the cabin windows reflected a woman I barely recognized. Her eyes were swollen, her lipstick was faded, and her composure was gone. Yet she looked more complete than the perfect officer who had stood in the cemetery. Strength was not the absence of pain. It was the ability to survive pain without letting it decide who you became. 3 days later, I was back at Camp Pendleton, behind the metal desk in my logistics office. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Beyond the window, a platoon called Cadence as it moved across the training area. My phone vibrated against the desk. The message came from a number I had never saved, but I knew the sender immediately. "Carly, please, you have to save me." Darren took the rental car and disappeared in the middle of the night. The sheriff arrived at 8 and changed the locks. The bank took the house. I am sitting on the curb with 2 suitcases and nowhere to go. You are rich now. Wire me $10,000 so I can get an apartment. We are sisters. Family has to help family. I read it twice. Family has to help family. The phrase came from the woman who had slept with my fiancé while wearing my military blouse. The woman who had helped steal money intended for our father's care. The woman who had mocked my service and tried to reduce me to a servant in front of the relatives. She did not apologize. She did not mention the account, the house, or our father. She simply demanded another transfer. I felt no pity. I also felt no rage. What remained was clean, cold indifference. I did not write a long response. I did not explain karma. I did not list her crimes, or demand that she understand my pain. A commanding officer does not negotiate with a hostile force after communication has served no useful purpose. I opened the contact information, scrolled to the bottom, and pressed the red words, block caller. The screen went dark. The final line connecting me to Vanessa disappeared. I later learned pieces of what happened through people who still considered gossip a form of family duty. Darren fled before dawn in the rented Mercedes, leaving Vanessa to face the sheriff alone. The architecture firm entered bankruptcy. The tax investigation continued. Creditors took what remained. Vanessa moved between couches until the relatives who had applauded her at the funeral grew tired of supporting her. I did not intervene. Their collapse was not my mission. Saving them had never been my duty. Every consequence they faced belonged to choices they had made when they believed I would always absorb the damage. The following morning, I stood before the full-length mirror in the bedroom Marcus and I shared. I was preparing for a high-level briefing. My service alpha uniform was crisp olive drab, every seam aligned, every ribbon placed precisely over my heart. I smoothed the fabric and looked at the record of my life, displayed across my chest campaigns, deployments, commendations, nights without sleep, people brought home safely, and missions completed when failure would have cost more than money. My fingers moved to the scar beneath my jaw. Darren had called it a flaw. Marcus called it courage. I called it evidence. I picked up the metal tube of burgundy lipstick and removed the cap. The shade was still the dark red of dried blood on a field dressing. I drew it across my lips slowly. It was not meant to make me softer. It was not a request for approval. It was the war paint of a woman who had walked through fire and learned that survival was not the same as living. I squared my shoulders and met my own eyes in the mirror. Vanessa had believed femininity was fragility, display, and the ability to attract envy. Darren had believed success was a rented car, a plated pen, and a room full of people too shallow to ask questions. My relatives had believed a woman's worth could be measured by whether a man stood beside her. They had been wrong about everything. My uniform did not make me less of a woman. My discipline did not make me dry. My refusal to perform weakness did not make me empty. The scars, the rank, the responsibility, and the strength to carry people through danger were not defects to be hidden. They were the architecture of the person I had fought to become. Marcus appeared in the mirror behind me. He adjusted one cuff, then rested his hands lightly on my shoulders. "Ready, Major?" he asked. I looked at the sapphire on my hand, at the words engraved inside the platinum band, and at the man who had never once asked me to surrender any part of myself to earn his love. "Always," I said. We left the room together. The domestic war was over. I had not won because Vanessa became homeless or because Darren lost his company. Their destruction was only the inevitable collapse of a structure built from theft and lies. I had won when I stopped allowing their opinion to define me. I had won when I chose not to resign. I had won when I understood that loyalty without boundaries becomes self-destruction. I had won when I accepted love that honored my strength instead of fearing it. And I had won when I finally believed what my father had written with his shaking hand. I was never the failure in that family. I was the one who carried it until carrying it began to kill me, and then I found the courage to set it down. No one who lacks a moral compass has the right to assign a price to your life. No betrayal can erase the honor with which you responded to it, and no family bond requires you to remain connected to people who treat your loyalty as permission to destroy you. I walked into the morning with my head high, my scar uncovered, my husband beside me, and my father's words secured inside my heart. For the first time in my life, I was not marching away from an enemy. I was marching toward peace.